Development is by no means complete at birth. The liver and kidneys are still not fully functional, and most joints have not yet ossified. Myelination of the nervous system is not complete until adolescence. Humans are born in a very immature state, but we have a high degree of parental care to nurture the neonate. There's a transitional period which is immediately following birth. It's basically a crisis in which the neonate must suddenly adapt to life outside of the mother's body. It's lived in an aqueous environment for the past 40 weeks. The first 6 to 8 hours, the heart and respiratory rate will increase and the body temperature will fall. Physical activity declines and the baby sleeps for about 3 hours. In the second period of activity, the baby often gags on mucus and debris in the pharynx, because after all, the lungs were previously not full of air, but full of fluid. The baby will sleep again after this second period of activity and become more stable. It begins a cycle of waking every 3 to 4 hours to feed. The neonatal period is considered to be the first 6 weeks of life. Probably the most profound adaptations are those in the circulatory system. As you've already learned, the fetal circulatory system is different than the adult circulatory system. The umbilical arteries and veins will no longer be necessary, so they become fibrous cords or ligaments. The umbilical arteries will become the median umbilical ligaments of the abdominal wall, and the umbilical vein will become the round ligament or the ligamentum teres of the liver. The ductus venosus becomes the ligamentum venosum that we find on the inferior surface of the liver. And the flaps of the foramen ovale fuse to close the shunt. This leaves a depression called the fossa ovalis in the interatrial septum of the heart. In some fetuses, the foramen ovale does not close properly, which causes circulatory problems because blood is moving between the right and left atrium rather than all of it being pushed down into the right ventricle. The ductus venosus will also collapse and form the ligamentum arteriosum between the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. There are also changes that happen in the respiratory system. The onset of breathing occurs because of CO2 accumulation. The placenta has become detached, so the fetus is no longer getting gas exchange through the placenta. As CO2 accumulates, it stimulates the respiratory chemoreceptors. It takes a great deal of effort to inflate the lungs for the first few breaths, as we're inflating the collapsed alveoli. And for the first 2 weeks, the fetus will breathe about 45 breaths per minute. They stabilize at about 12 breaths per minute after this period, which is the way we breathe in adulthood. There are also immunological adaptations. Cellular immunity appears in early fetal development, but it's still very weak. Fortunately, an infant's born with near adult levels of IgG acquired from the mother through the placenta. The maternal IgG breaks down fairly rapidly after birth and declines to about half the initial level in the first month, and to essentially none by about 10 months of age. The maternal IgG levels remain fairly high for the first 6 months, enough to protect the infant from measles, diphtheria, polio, and most other infectious diseases, but not whooping cough. By 6 months, the infant's own IgG reaches about half the typical adult level. The lowest total maternal plus infant levels of IgG occur around 5 to 6 months of age. This means this is a period where the infant is least protected by the immune system. And respiratory infections are especially common. A breastfed neonate is going to also acquire protection from gastroenteritis, from IgA that's present in the colostrum of the mother's breast milk. Thermoregulation and fluid balance are also critical aspects of neonatal physiology. An infant has a larger surface area to volume ratio, and so it'll lose heat much more easily. One of its defenses against hypothermia is brown fat, which is deposited during weeks 17 to 20 of their fetal life. The mitochondria in brown fat release all the energy in pyruvic acid and release it as heat rather than using it to make ATP. Thus, brown fat is a heat-generating tissue. As the neonate grows and increases its metabolic rate, it'll produce more heat. Also, it'll accumulate subcutaneous fat, which aids the neonate in retaining heat. Now, the kidneys are not fully developed at birth either, so they cannot concentrate urine as well as an adult kidney. Thus, they have a high rate of water loss, which requires much more fluid intake relative to body weight than you would expect in an adult. Now, some infants are born premature. An infant is considered premature if it's under 5.5 pounds. We'll notice multiple difficulties in respiration, thermoregulation, excretion, digestion, and liver function. The respiratory system's adequately developed by 7 months of gestation, and it can support independent life. But infants that are born before this have a deficiency of pulmonary surfactant. And surfactant is a substance that allows the lungs to stay inflated rather than collapsing with each inhalation. So, before 7 months, an infant may suffer from infant respiratory distress syndrome, or IRDS. This causes the alveoli to collapse with each exhalation, and filling them again costs a lot of energy. The infant can become very fatigued by these high energy demands. It can be treated by ventilating the lungs with oxygen-rich air and using an inhaled surfactant to coat the lungs. Still, IRDS remains the most common cause of death in the neonate. A premature infant has an incompletely formed hypothalamus, and thus it has problems with thermoregulation. They can be kept in an incubator to regulate their temperature. There are many digestive issues. There's a small stomach volume and underdeveloped suckling and swallowing reflexes. So often a premature neonate will need to be fed through a nasogastric or nasoduodenal tube. They can tolerate human milk or formula, but they'll also need other nutritional supplements that would have been obtained from the mother in the last weeks of gestation, like calcium, phosphorus, and lots of protein. The liver is also poorly developed. And now that you know that it has a very diverse array of functions, you can probably understand this will have several serious consequences. First of all, the liver synthesizes inadequate amounts of albumin, so the baby suffers from hypoproteinemia, so not enough protein in the blood. This upsets the balance between the capillary filtration and reabsorption, and thus leads to edema. We'll also see a deficiency in clotting factors, so a baby can bleed very easily, and also jaundice from the accumulation of bile. A birth defect or congenital anomaly is the abnormal structure or position of an organ at birth that results in a defect in prenatal development. The study of these defects is called teratology. Not all birth defects are noticeable at birth. Some of them are detected months or years later when a child enters school. The agents that cause these anatomical deformities in the fetus fall into 3 major classes. They're called teratogens. They can be drugs or other chemicals, infectious diseases, or radiation such as X-rays. Teratogen exposure during the first 2 weeks may not cause congenital anomalies. However, they most often cause a spontaneous abortion or miscarriage. The period of the greatest vulnerability are weeks 3 through 8. Different organs have different critical periods. For example, limb abnormalities are most likely to result from teratogen exposure during days 24 through 36, because this is the period when the limb buds develop in the embryo. Brain abnormalities often result from exposure during the 3rd to 16th weeks, because this is the primary stage where the brain is developing. Perhaps the most notorious teratogenic drug is thalidomide. It was a sedative that was marketed in 1957, and it was taken by women in early pregnancy, often before they knew they were pregnant. And it has severe teratogenic effects on limb development. Babies are born with unformed arms and legs, and often with defects of the ears, heart, and intestines. This is a really controversial drug because it was prescribed to women and we just didn't know the effects. In some third world countries, it's still taken in misguided attempts to treat things like leprosy and AIDS. Thus, we see an upswing in birth defects in these regions. Alcohol causes more birth defects than any other drug in our present day. Fetal alcohol syndrome is characterized by a small head, malformed facial features, cardiac and central nervous system defects, stunted growth, and behavioral signs such as hyperactivity, nervousness, and poor attention span. But they say even one drink a day can have some noticeable effects. Again, this is a fairly controversial area. Some authorities are welcoming a woman to have a glass of wine each day because it has certain health benefits, and the decreased level of stress is considered a healthy aspect. After all, high exposure of cortisol causes developmental issues also. Cigarette smoking certainly contributes to fetal and infant mortality. It can cause an increase in ectopic pregnancies and anencephaly, or failure of the whole cerebrum, to develop. We might see cleft palate and cleft lip, as well as cardiac anomalies. It's recommended that women stay away from diagnostic x-rays during pregnancy because these also could be teratogenic. There are many other teratogens that a fetus could be exposed to during development. Perhaps you'd like to go on an exploration. Again, these could be great topics for your presentation at the end of the semester if you wanted to do a last-minute switch. And finally, we can see some microorganisms actually cross the placenta and can cause serious congenital abnormalities, or even stillbirth or neonatal death. Some are viral infections like herpes simplex, rubella, and cytomegalovirus, as well as HIV. All of these can cross the placenta, and a fetus is likely to be born with these infections. Bacterial infections like gonorrhea and syphilis or toxoplasma can also be passed on to the fetus. They can produce blindness, hydrocephalus, cerebral palsy, seizures, and profound physical and mental retardation. Toxoplasma is a protozoan that's contracted from meat or unpasteurized milk, as well as house cats. Some of these pathogens have relatively mild effects in adults, but because of its immature immune system, the fetus is highly vulnerable to the devastating effects. Genetic anomalies are the most common cause of birth defects, accounting for an estimated 1/3 of all cases. And one cause of genetic defects is mutagens, or changes in the DNA structure. Mutagens can cause achondroplastic dwarfism, or microcephaly, stillbirth, and childhood cancer. Mutations can occur through errors in DNA replication during the cell cycle, or under the influence of environmental agents called mutagens, including some chemicals, viruses, and radiation. Some of the most common genetic disorders arise from the failure of homologous chromosomes to separate during meiosis. You may recall in general biology, we discussed the idea of nondisjunction. Disjunction is the normal separation of chromosomes. Let's look here in this parent cell. It has two X chromosomes. When they disjoin properly, those two homologous chromosomes separate in the process of gamete formation. Each daughter cell, in this case, receives one X chromosome. And when fertilized by a sperm, the sperm either brings an X or a Y, and we resume the diploid state and have an XX or XY zygote, which would form a normal female or a normal male. In the case of non-disjunction, we see a pair of chromosomes fails to separate properly. So the parent cell here, once we go through meiosis, one daughter cell gets both X chromosomes and the other gets none. So when this egg is fertilized, if it got both X chromosomes, you have a zygote that is triplo X. And in the other case, where the egg has no X chromosome, we would have an XO, or just one X. Both of these result in a syndrome, Turner's syndrome or triplo X syndrome. Now, for some reason, we can handle these aneuploidies, the presence of extra or less chromosomes than normal, with our sex chromosomes. However, aneuploidies in non-sex chromosomes are uncommon, and often the fetus is spontaneously aborted. Monosomy is the condition of having only one of a particular chromosome, and trisomy is having an extra chromosome. Now, there are procedures to detect aneuploidies prior to birth, like amniocentesis or chorionic villi sampling. In amniocentesis, we're examining cells that are floating around in the amniotic fluid. In chorionic villi sampling, we actually remove and examine cells of the chorion, because the chorion is the fetal tissue. There are several conditions that can exist in nondisjunction of sex chromosomes. As I previously said, when we see nondisjunction in sex chromosomes, often the fetus will survive. Triplo X syndrome is where usually the egg, having two X chromosomes, is fertilized by an X-carrying sperm. This results in a female with mild intellectual impairment that is infertile. If the sperm happened to be carrying a Y, then we would see Klinefelter's syndrome. Let's say the egg has two X's from nondisjunction, and the Y came from the sperm. Again, we have a male that's sterile. This male would have average intelligence and undeveloped testes. Turner syndrome is another condition that results from the egg having no X chromosomes and being fertilized by an X-carrying sperm. 97% of these cases will die before birth, but the survivors show really no serious impairment as children. They have a little bit of web structure in the neck and widely spaced nipples, and the secondary sexual characteristics fail to develop at puberty. These individuals are sterile. Now, not all nondisjunction occurs in eggs. Sometimes the nondisjunction could be in the formation of sperm. We do see that the rate of nondisjunction increases with the age of an individual, and it's much more prevalent in the eggs than it is in sperm. And this makes sense because, after all the eggs that a female produces were formed way before she was born. And they have to stay there, arrested, after meiosis 1, until they're ovulated. Obviously, as the woman gets older, the eggs are older. And the mechanisms that orchestrate meiosis sometimes become less functional as we age. There are only 3 autosomal trisomies that are survivable. They involve chromosomes 13, 18, and 21. Fetal syndrome is trisomy of chromosome 13, and Edwards syndrome is trisomy of chromosome 18. Nearly all of these individuals will die before birth, and infants that are born are severely deformed. Less than 5% of them will survive for 1 year. Trisomies of any of the other autosomes are simply not survivable. These conceptuses will either not implant or will be spontaneously aborted very early in pregnancy. Now, trisomy of chromosome 21 is the most survivable. This is the one that brings us Down syndrome. We'll see impaired physical development, short stature, a relatively flat face with flat nasal brow, low-set ears, epicanthal folds in the medial corners of the eye, so just a little extra fold, enlarged and protruding tongues, stubby fingers, a broad hand with one palmar crease instead of the several that we see in an unaffected individual. They usually have outgoing, affectionate personalities, and mental retardation is common. Sometimes it's very severe. We see Down syndrome in 1 in 700 or 800 live births in the US, so it's fairly prevalent. 75% of these fetuses will die before birth, and 20% of those that are born die before age 10. Those that survive beyond the age of 10 have a life expectancy of about 60 years. Again, eggs have less and less ability to separate their chromosomes as they age. The chance of having Down syndrome in a child is 1 in 3,000 in women that are under 30, and 1 in 365 by the age of 35. By the age of 48, the chances are 1 in 9. So the older a woman is, the more important it is to have testing done like chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis to see if there are any abnormalities in the fetus.